Right. Hey, Rob and Klloo. So, the Max Armory deck is fast approaching, and I gotta say, out of all of them so far, this one has definitely piqued my interest the most, just because from the perspective of advancing an archetype, right, printing unique new cards, this Armory deck definitely does it a bit better than what we've seen. Maybe with the exception of the Jarl Armory deck, but that being an Origins Armory deck, that you sort of expect it, right? So, yeah. Advancing hyperdrivers for mech is going to be a thing, and so far all the cards look pretty juicy. Now, if you missed it, LSS did spoil it, right? They released the Max Armory deck versus Aurora Armory deck video a little bit early, so we did see the brunt of the new cards, and we did also go through them, but I thought we'd spend a little bit more time just diving a little bit deeper into them, because again, I really do want to play Max both out of the box and then tinker with it and see where exactly he lands in terms of actually becoming a competitive hero, right? Because there is a lot of stuff in here that definitely does enable exactly what he wants to do. Starting off with the big one, which is going to be his new Puffer Jacket. So Puffer Jacket is just a super impactful card, right? If we're running hyperdrivers, this basically seems like an absolute must. For comparison's sake, we have our red hyperdriver, yellow, and blue. So usually they would enter with 3 steam counters, 2 and 1, right? Which, when it comes to the blue hyperdriver, is the most relevant aspect because it ends up making the blue hyperdriver pretty non-functional, right? As Max, you can crank your hyperdrivers, so you can play it, you can crank it, and you can still do stuff. You can use it to set up for some of those onboard payoffs. But in terms of the blue hyperdriver, if you were to crank it, it would destroy itself, right? It would no longer have a steam counter, and therefore it gets destroyed. Meaning that playing your blue hyperdrivers can be very awkward because it's something that you can only do at the end of your turn, and it will only last you for 1 extra turn. As soon as you boost, you use that steam counter, and it gets destroyed. Now, thanks to our Puffer Jacket, non-token hyperdrivers that we control enter the arena with an additional steam counter, meaning that our red goes to 4, our yellow goes to 3, and more importantly, our blue goes to 2, which makes it equivalent to the hyperdriver token that Max does generate. So the token comes with 2 steam counters, right, which now means that we can A, crank it, meaning that we can play multiple things in that turn, right? And then it also lasts for an extra turn, meaning that, again, having them stay around on the board so that we can hit that magic number of 3 hyperdrivers to get our payoff cards up and running is going to be a lot easier, right? Instead of taking 6 hyperdrivers in our deck, we can now take 9. From a utilization standpoint, right? So you could max, you get your token hyperdriver, right? You don't have to crank it because it's most likely going to be the thing you do at the end of your turn. But then the following turn, you can use Max's ability or you can play your blue hyperdriver or both, crank them, right? And then they still last on board, thanks to the extra steam counter that the blue one gets, and then go into your payoff card, right? So that makes it hugely impactful in just increasing the consistency of, again, those hyperdriver payoffs. So with that in mind, what are the payoffs? Well, from our deck, we can utilize a card like Hyper X3. From our board, we can utilize Construct Bankbreaker, Construct Nitro Mechanoid, and our Moonshot. And then from our graveyard, we can utilize a card like Hyper Scrapper. So we'll start left, right? So Hyper X3. This allows us to basically put a hyperdriver underneath it whenever we banish it from boosting. Now, worth noting, that is not a may. If you banish a hyperdrive from boosting while you have Hyper X3, you must put it under it. And then once per turn, when you put a hyperdriver under it, if there are 3 or more hyperdrivers, you get to draw a card. Meaning from the 3rd hyperdriver that you boost away onwards, you get an extra card, which could be a nice amount of tempo, but the big drawback here is, again, the fact that it's not a may, meaning that it does lock out utilizing those hyperdrivers, because it has Battle Worn, meaning that you can't block with it, break it, and then get those hyperdrivers into your graveyard. The only way to basically get to that point is to use it for something like Construct Nitro Mechanoid, or have your opponent be very nice and break it for you, right? So Hyper X3, while again being a nice tempo card, probably gets outpaced now, since again the consistency of our hyperdrivers does go up. For our onboard, we have our new card Construct Bankbreaker, which allows us to transform a wrench that we have equipped, along with 3 hyperdrivers, again, not a may, it has to be 3 hyperdrivers, into a Bankbreaker, meaning that a Bankbreaker that we equip off of Construct Bankbreaker starts with 4 of its undercard resources to give it go again and overpower, right? So again, we can make 3 copies of this, meaning that we can create a whole bunch of weapon swings and do a lot of nasty things on board. Similarly, we again have our Construct Nitro Mechanoid, the big usual payoff for Max, so transform this along with every bit of equipment, so a head, chest, arms, and legs, along with a weapon, and again, 3 hyperdrivers to then create our Nitro Mechanoid, which is basically a nice big swingable weapon as well, although it has a bit more of a constraint, right? There's no easy way to give a go again with high octane Gone, it's a little bit more troublesome to use than, say, Bankbreaker, which again starts with that fuel to give it go again, but it is still 5 with Overpower as a swing, which is definitely nice if you can rack up a whole bunch of cards underneath it. Then, in terms of Moonshot, play this only if you boosted this turn. As an additional cost to play this, destroy X hyperdrives you control, where X is half its cost. When this attacks, it gets +3 for each hyperdriver you destroy, and then if it has 10 or more power, it gets Overpower. Meaning to get to the point of 10 or more power, you have to pay at least 4 and get 1 extra buff from something else, or most likely pay 6 and destroy 3 hyperdrivers. Remember, it seems like 3 hyperdrivers is the magic number for max, right? So Moonshot can be a really nice payoff, but it is still slightly awkward to use. Again, getting to that point of giving it Overpower or just making it a really excessively big card means that we do have those constraints of A, the resource cost, which can be quite hefty, because, for instance, if we were to boost, use the steam counters on our hyperdrives and destroy them, that's less fuel for Moonshot, even though we're getting the resources off of them. It's still going to be a really nice payoff card, still 3 block, and it's a yellow pitchable. And then from the graveyard, we have our Hyper Scrapper, another X card. As an additional cost to play this, banish X items from your graveyard. When this attacks, it gets +X. If 3 or more hyperdrivers were banished to play this, gain 6 resources, and this gets go again. So this is a really, really good fuel card, especially if you can line up the dream state, right, of having 3 hyperdrivers on board and 3 hyperdrivers in your graveyard. You could Hyper Scrapper, get rid of the ones from your graveyard, and then go into Moonshot, right, for a nice big swing, right? And you'd still have a little bit of fuel left over to do something else, right? Boost, gain resources of some other hyperdrivers, right? It's, again, the dream, but a little bit awkward, trying to line up having just, again, those 9 hyperdrivers spread across all these different places. If you take HyperX 3, very unlikely, right? And again, the tokens for reference can't go into your graveyard or your banish zone. They can go as resources as the undercards for your transformations, for your constructs, but as soon as you were to banish them, they get destroyed, right? They don't exist. So using them for your Hyper Scrapper isn't quite as easy as, say, using it for something like Moonshot. Now, in terms of our Construct Nitro Mechanoid, right? So usually it's a 4 cost, requires us to make 3 hyperdrivers on board, but there's a few different ways we can break this up. So we can make it a 5 cost by maintaining 2 hyperdrivers and playing 1 hyperdriver from hand. It can be a 6 cost if we maintain 2 hyperdrivers and use max ability, or a 7 cost if we maintain 1 hyperdriver, use max ability, and play 1 hyperdriver in hand, which is, again, something that now is a lot more achievable because we can play max ability the previous turn, get 1 token hyperdriver, and then on our turn, if we draw a hyperdriver, we can play it along with max's ability to then be able to go into our Construct Nitro Mechanoid. We also, again, have the whole mechanic of hyperdrivers being able to boost, right, gain the resource, and then use that to discount this cost, right? So for max, we do have to boost in order to create the hyperdriver, and it is going to be a 2 cost. And then for hyperdrivers themselves, we do have to be wary of the steam counters left. If they're cranked, that's 1 less steam counter, meaning that when we boost, because again, it's not a May, if you boost, you gain the resource, you lose the steam counter, we might accidentally destroy them. But overall, again, having that consistency of running all 3 colors of hyperdrivers will make Nitro Mechanoid a much easier payoff. And it was definitely something that was already being done as max, right, as your big finisher, but it's now just going to be that little bit more consistent. But in comparison to our Bankbreaker to me is just straight up a lot better. So cost-wise, right, 3 costs, maintain 3 hyperdrivers on board, and this could net you 3 swings because you are creating a new weapon when you play the card, right? So if you start with Banksy, start with a Bankbreaker, you can swing with that, play Construct, and then utilize new swings from the new weapon that you've just created. So this means it could be equivalent to a 4 cost, right, where we maintain the 3 hyperdrives on board and then are able to swing 4 times. 5 cost, maintain 2, 1 hyperdrive from hand, again, still netting us those 4 swings, and then a 6 cost, 2 hyperdrives on board plus max's ability for another 4 swings, right? So really being able to just play them back to back and get those 4 swing turns is super impactful, because usually by playing hyperdrives, by playing these setup cards, we lose tempo, we lose an impact, right? And that's usually a huge detriment to any type of deck. So by having this weapon that is twice per turn, and again, replaceable, is a huge, huge win. And that's basically why I like Construct Bankbreaker significantly more than Nitro, along with the fact that it doesn't consume your equipment. You still get a lot of use out of the really good equipment pieces that we are now seeing, right? If you Nitro and you lose your Puffer Jacket, you lose your Valiant Dynamos for Mech, you lose the new Fist Bump card if you are running that, right? So there is a lot more downside to Nitro if it's not winning you the game, whereas Construct Bankbreaker is just something you're going to try and do whenever you can do it, right? So, in terms, again, of swinging, right, 2 costs for 6 power in terms of the weapon, but it does require either 1 action point generated or a card underneath it in order to proc its overpower and go again effect. So again, still really nice stats, right? Especially since it's an onboard card. So again, 2 cost, 6 power, 1 card pitched, 1 card remaining, boost with 2 hyperdrives on board, and you can get real good value out of your weapon. Then again, Construct Bankbreaker itself creates a new weapon, allowing us to then swing an additional 2 times if we go from Bankbreaker to Bankbreaker, making it a potential 4 cost, 12 power weapon, right? Which is, again, phenomenal stats for something that exists on board. If we were to throw in something like Clamp Press, which gives our wrenches a +2, then we go to a 2 cost, 10 power swing, right? Or a 4 cost, 20 power swings, right? And that is such great value, right? So again, this completely, in my mind, makes up for the fact that you're taking hyperdrivers, you're playing hyperdrivers, and you might be playing some of these other toolkit items, if you will, right, to make the deck more functional, and therefore losing tempo from the normal, just play 3 boost attacks, maybe a buff, and shoot with your pistol, right? So this is definitely inching Max forward in towards just being a nice competitive mech. Now, Fist Bump. So Fist Bump is also really, really interesting because I didn't notice it's actually uncapped. So whenever you banish a hyperdriver from boosting, target wrench you control gets +1 this turn, meaning that if you somehow miraculously line up all 9 hyperdrivers to banish, you could give your wrench +9, swing it twice for +18, right? Absolutely absurd, not going to happen, but it's still scary. If you can line up 1 hyperdriver, that's already really nice, getting the +2, right? Because essentially it is a +2 with Bankbreaker. If you can line up 2 hyperdrivers, a +4 off your arm slot, right? Really, really good. So yeah, the only other caveat with Fist Bump is the fact that it targets a specific wrench, meaning that if we were to convert Banksy or Bankbreaker into a Bankbreaker, the wrench that we target would disappear, right? So you boost, you gain your resources, you get a hyperdriver, you target your current wrench, but then you play Construct, places a wrench, meaning that it's no longer the target wrench, and therefore does not have the buff from Fist Bump. Now, in terms of action points, so High Octane is of course banned, which is a huge detriment in my mind for Nitro, but there are still ways for us to get around generating action points, right? We have a few strong cards and then a few average. And basically, the way I've categorized them is by how many extra cards they require. So, for instance, Heist, Gas Up, and System Reset require no additional items in hand, whereas Expedite, MedX, Quantum Processor, or even Evo Cogs Better require you to have an item in hand to play, meaning that not only do you have to get over their conditions to then land the put an item into play, but you also have to lose an extra card from hand, which is definitely a detriment. But all of them do put an item into play without playing the item, meaning that you can crank said item, if it does have crank, to then gain an action point, right? Meaning that we can then, cover the cost for swinging with Nitro, cover the cost for swinging with our Bankbreaker, right, if we don't have enough resources. So definitely still strong cards, definitely cards you will want to consider when building Max's deck. So Heist, when this hits a hero, you may put an item with cost 0 or 1 from any banish zone into the arena under your control. So 2 for 5 with boost, and then again, if it hits, you get that item. Gas Up is a bit more specific, but the stat line I do kind of like more. So you may put a hyperdriver from your banish zone into the arena, but it's a 1 for +4, which is already kind of nice stat line, right? Has go again. And then you also have the fact that the put the hyperdriver into play is not conditional, right? As long as you have one banished, again, if it was boosted, it would be locked away with Hyper X3, so do consider that. But if it's just boosted without Hyper X3, you can play Gas Up, still get a nice stat line onto another attack, and then put a hyperdriver into play. As for System Reset, so bash X Mechanoid items you control with cost 0/1, then return them to the arena under their owner's control. So this would effectively be a 2 cost to generate 1 action point and require us to have 2 non-token items in play. So if you were to banish, again, the tokens that you generate through Max's ability, they would cease to exist. You wouldn't banish them and then put them back in play, be able to crank them. They would just cease to exist. So you do have to have 2 non-token items that you can crank in order to benefit the action points from System Reset, but it still seems like a very, very valid use. Again, utilizing Bankbreaker to make up for playing cards like this, right? So you reset the Steam counters on your hyperdrivers, you profit action points, and then you're able to make up for the fact that you're not really playing a card that does anything towards your opponent, right? By then swinging with Bankbreaker with the action point that you've generated. So again, Bankbreaker being the tool that facilitates all of these cards to now have much more functional use is what's really important, and why I'm kind of really excited about the Max Armory deck in comparison to some of the other cards we've got. They're great, right? And they definitely help the deck that they're in, but they're not as impactful to me as what we're getting with Max. Now, in terms of the average cards, so Expedite, MedX, both on hit, put a item with cost 0/1 from your hand into the arena. So again, a bit difficult to utilize because you're losing that item, right? Again, converting it to a swing, so it's still nice in that regard, but not as nice as Heist or Gas Up or System Reset, right? That are getting you all those benefits without actually going one card extra. But Quantum Processor, so once per turn instant, put a Mechanoid item with 0/1 from your hand into the arena, meaning that to end your turn, you could play Quantum Processor, you don't have to crank it, and you can then use its instant to put an item in play. You can then draw another item, put it into play on your opponent's turn, and then on your next turn, you get one more turn of Quantum Processor, right? Play another item, opponent's turn, play another item. So potentially, if you have enough items in your deck, Quantum Processor could net you 4 items into play, and that is really, really impactful. You can't get the action points on your opponent's turn, but it's still impactful to set them up. So in terms of just cranking out those hyperdrivers, I can see Quantum Processor actually doing something quite valid. Similar Evo Cogs splitter. So if we were to take in Evo Arms, which I doubt we are because Fist Bump to me is nice enough. Otherwise, there's just some other cards, right? Galvanic Bender with Nitro is really, really good. So I can't see you taking Evo base, but Evo Cogs splitter, once per turn, show a card under this, put an item with 0/1 from your hand into the arena. So it'd be similar to Quantum Processor, but again, it does have that cost of a card underneath. So unless you go through the whole setup of hitting all the different Evo bases, right, you're not really going to get many cards out of Evo Cogs splitter. But I do want to definitely say Quantum Processor could be the strongest out of those cards, at least in my opinion, right? Expedite Med-X, just as solid boost attacks, is still nice, right? But again, losing one extra card from hand is going to still be a tempo loss, right? Not as nice as the top line, right? Then, in terms of the actual play patterns, if you will. So imagine we have our hyperdrive set up. How are we trying to utilize them? Well, we start with a card that boosts. So 0 to 60, we boost, we gain resources. Now, again, with Hyper X3, if we were to hit a hyperdrive off the top of our deck, we'd be able to boost it away and then put it under Hyper X3. If we get to that 3 or more, we get that tempo boost of getting a new card and being able to play it on our turn. Having 5 cards is nice, but I don't think, again, worth locking away the hyperdrivers. So then with those resources, right, the ultimate payoff is to try and then go into Moonshot. Moonshot, we destroy our hyperdrives on board, right? We get a sizable attack, but again, we're sort of missing the action point. If we can generate the action point before going to Moonshot, I like it a bit more. And then once they're in the graveyard, we go Hyper Scrapper. We get our resources, and then we swing, right? That would be my ideal line of play. Boost, get some resources, use those resources for Moonshot, probably in conjunction with, unfortunately, another card. Moonshot away some hyperdrivers, and then use Hyper Scrapper to recycle them, right? Get them into our banish zone. And then once they're in our banish zone, we have cards like Heist and Gas Up again that allow us to put them back into play, or even Blessing of Ingenuity. Although I do feel Blessing of Ingenuity, although it has a sizable payoff, being able to put up to 3 hyperdrives into play from either the graveyard or banish zone, is still a little bit too slow, although it is a 3 block, so that's not horrible, right? Put this out at the end of your turn. If you draw it, right, and you need to, it's definitely a card you can just block away with, right? So Blessing of Ingenuity might have a place, but there's a lot going on. I feel like it's not needed. And then, of course, once we hit that magic 3 hyperdrivers, we can go into our Construct Bankbreaker or our Construct Nitro Mechanoid and just continue the cycle all over, right? So again, I do think it's valid playlines, right? The Moonshot doesn't have to be Moonshot. Just getting the resources of boost could then go into our Wrench, could then go into some of our other boosting cards like Twin Drive or some of the big payoffs that Mech have, right? And again, the big boost of resource from Hyper Scrapper, I'd like to fuel it into Moonshot, but it's going to be super difficult to line up 3 hyperdrivers in the graveyard as well as some on board to actually utilize with Moonshot, right? Again, you have 9 basically that can go into the graveyard or banish zone. So yeah, there's not a lot of leeway there, but still nice to think about and consider. So then in terms of maintaining our hyperdrivers, so we can use Max's ability to shore up our hyperdrivers. The main goal would still be to Hyper Scrapper. It's either just a card we pitch away or a card we play for a 5 that still then nets us a sizable amount of resources. We put 3 into it, we get 3 extra out, right? And that can then lead into a bunch of better cards like Heist and Gas Up to then again take the hyperdrivers that we just banished and put them back into play, right? So I do really like Hyper Scrapper. I think it's definitely a lot more valid than Moonshot, right? Just because of the super flexibility, either pitched away as a blue or again play it and scrap. But then for the curious choices, so Plasma Mainline. This is something that I am considering, but I do unfortunately think it's probably too slow. If it was a 1 cost and we can get into play with some of those other cards, maybe, but it would be really nice, especially with something like the, say, Clamp Press, being able to put more steam counters on it, and again, maintain it just that little bit longer. So Plasma Mainline enters the arena with 5 steam counters, and then when it has no, destroy it. When a Mechanoid item with cost 2 or less enters, we may put a steam counter from Plasma Mainline on it. So again, basically extends all of them by 1 turn. Now, in terms of some other cards to utilize, we have Evo Recall, right, which fits very nicely with the in-box headpiece, right, that Max will get because it is a Evo base. So when this is equipped, put up to 1 Mechanologist action card from our banish zone on top of our deck, allowing us to basically line up a Hyperdriver. And that could go into a multitude of different things. Again, we had Fist Bump if we banish the Hyperdriver from the top of the deck, right, or we have ways to then put it into play. So Klloo Veasan's Workshop allows us to reveal the top card of our deck. If it's a Mechanologist item, we get to put it into the arena. Similarly, BIOS Update, right, allows us to not only buff our next boost attack, but do the same thing. So the next time a Mechanologist item with 2 or less is banished to pay for a boost cost, we may put it into the arena. So I definitely like BIOS Update most out of this, but taking Evo Recall as a way to line up Fist Bump, line up a nice swing turn with your wrenches is definitely, something to consider, because it's still a blue pitchable. The 0 block obviously is quite a negative, but nice nonetheless. And then Prismatic Lens as an alternative to that. So similarly to Quantum Processor, because the ability is instant, you don't have to crank it. You can play it as the last thing of your turn, use the instant, and then on your opponents use the instant, then on your turn use the instant, then on your opponents use the instant, meaning that you could set up 4 cards on top of your deck with its effect of reveal the top card of your deck, and then put a Mechanoid item of the same color from your banish zone on top of your deck, right? So in terms of, again, Fist Bump, and lining up those Hyperdrivers to actually get the +1, it's actually a lot easier than you might think if you look at the right cards. Again, standout would be BIOS Update, though, because I would rather boost them, get the buff, and then put them into play, right? Plus, then you get the +3, so a 0 for 3, already normal stat line, right? And then you're also getting these extra things on top of it. I think BIOS Update definitely fits, right? And then a copy or 2 of, say, Prismatic Lens or our Quantum Processor to, again, help align things a bit more consistently. Overall, right, Hyperdrivers are looking really, really nice, just because, again, the biggest issue with what was going on was the loss in tempo of playing them, right? And not really getting any real benefits straight away. Now that we have a lot better ways to get that payoff. Again, whether that's just they stick around and we get more resources out of it, or acting directly as fuel for a weapon that we get to swing twice, is highly significant. Because again, swinging twice means, think of it as just having a weapon and then having a 1 cost 3, right? Just having that extra ability to convert, again, some other sort of action that doesn't normally pressure our opponent in any sense into an extra swing. So that's absolutely phenomenal. I'm just really ecstatic, right? I can't wait to see what else the Max Armory deck brings come the 17th. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.